We talk with Joseph Bloch, a.k.a. the Greyhawk Grognard, about his new book, Swords of Cthulhu, today on Dungeon Craft.
Deathbringer here. Subscribe so you never miss an upload.
Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Professor.
Tell me all about Swords of Cthulhu.
Swords of Cthulhu lets you bring Lovecraftian horror into a first edition AD&D milieu. So, because first edition has certain expectations, both mechanically and in terms of its implied setting. So what this does is it takes the tropes from Lovecraftian horror and inserts them into those expectations. So it uses existing mechanics and it uses existing setting material, but it gives it that Lovecraftian twist.
Tell me about the new classes, the Cultist and the Scholar.
Two new classes. The Cultist is a subclass of Cleric. Each Cultist worships a particular Lovecraftian deity. So there'll be a cultist of Cthulhu, a cultist of Dagon, or whatever. Depending on which deity you serve, you're going to have specific spells in your spell list, or you're going to have different powers and abilities that are particular to that deity. The Scholar is a subclass of magic user, and they're in a bit more of an ambiguous position. Some scholars are servants of the Lovecraftian deities, and some scholars are actually fighting against them. And their spell lists kind of reflect that dichotomy there.
So you've got new Cthulhu, Lovecraftian type spells as well.
Exactly. There's a mix of spells that were from the original books as well as new spells, and they're interspersed on the list depending on how relevant they are to the various classes.
I love that, how you integrate your spells with the traditional spell list, so you got them all in the same place.
Right. Some of them just make sense. So, for example, a cultist of Yig, which is the Lovecraftian snake deity, has a lot of serpent-themed spells. And there are already some spells like that in the original spell list. So I just took those and gave them to those cultists.
Tell me about the insanity mechanics and all those different disorders. You've got a huge list.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that my book had the longest list of insanity types of any book of its kind. It was kind of a challenge to myself. So I believe there's 1,000 of them in there. I wanted to steer away from like insanity points or having an insanity stat or something like that. And I wanted to go back to the original mechanics that First Edition has. So First Edition uses saving throws as one of its big mechanics, and I used that as the insanity mechanic here. So I add a new type of saving throw, which is the insanity saving throw, and there are different severities. So depending on how it works, you can have a mild case of one type of insanity or a very severe kind. And the insanities, a lot of them also have triggers. Something will set you off a lot of times in the way that the insanity is set up. So if you see a beach, that could set you off, and all of a sudden, your insanity manifests itself.
You got a lot of random charts.
Yes.
Tell me about them.
Well, random charts are a hallmark of old school D&D stuff. So I've got tons of random charts. We talked about the random charts for the insanity. There are random tables for all kinds of different things, including things like dungeon dressing. At the end, there's also a random happenings table. And it basically lets you bring in things that you would normally see in a D&D game. So, for example, dungeon dressing. That is something that you saw in the original DM's guide. What I've done here is take that expectation and twisted it along a Lovecraftian line, so that instead of burned out torches or whatever, you have things like the wall starts to bleed. Things that are just very odd and bizarre and fit in well with a Lovecraftian game.
One of the interesting things to me is that you really stuck close to the Lovecraft as opposed to the wider mythos with August Derleth and all.
Correct. And that's a large part due to copyright, because most of Lovecraft's work is in the public domain. And most of the work of the Lovecraft Circle, the other authors, Derleth and so forth, aren't. So I was forced to stick closely to just the Lovecraftian material and a few stories that he co-wrote with other people that also passed into public domain. What that actually did was free me up, because the later authors built on that foundation and added so much detail and so many layers that it was almost stifling. But because I had to go back to the original Lovecraft material, I was liberated in a way. And you see that in, say, the relationship between the King in Yellow and Hastur. In some of the newer books, that's very well developed and very defined and explored. But because I didn't have access to that, I was free to develop my own relationship between the two, so that the King in Yellow becomes a servant of Hastur and almost his herald for invading new worlds.
Swords of Cthulhu is essentially a D&D Call of Cthulhu.
I wouldn't compare it to Call of Cthulhu so much because Call of Cthulhu has a very set narrative in the game. You're an investigator, you're fighting against the Great Old Ones, and so forth. In this game, it's a lot more ambiguous because you could, in theory, be a servant of one of the Great Old Ones. One of the things I talk about in how to set up a campaign using the book is there's a possibility that you could have the Lovecraftian mythos as the gods of your campaign setting, so that you're actually a cultist would be the establishment type priest. Or you could also have it where those used to be the way things were, and now new gods are coming in with traditional clerics and so forth. So you have that conflict. But the book definitely allows for the player characters to serve the Lovecraftian deities.
The art, the layout really reminds me of the old Fiend Folio. You're a big Fiend Folio fan.
Yes. I very deliberately wanted to do callbacks to the old games to bring up that feel of nostalgia and to make it very plain that if you saw this book, you know what you're getting. It's got that nice crisp 2-column layout. The interior is all black and white. It uses the line art. And what I did with the line art, because if you remember in the old DM's Guide or the Monster Manual, you would get very different kinds of artwork right next to each other, juxtaposed on the same page sometimes. And I loved that aesthetic it felt much more of a hobbyist thing than you see today, where the artwork is very much homogenized and it looks like it's all come from the same artist. And I wanted to go back to that original aesthetic. So I have a bunch of different artists that I use, and they all have very different styles. And I really like the way that looks on the page.
Swords of Cthulhu, where can we get it?
It is available on Drive-Thru RPG. It is available in hardcover and in PDF. And if you buy the hardcover, you get the PDF for free.
Very cool. You know what else is available at Drive-Thru RPG? My own game, Deathbringer, and the Eldritch Hack. And you can also find links below to Dungeon Craft on Facebook and Patreon. Thanks so much for stopping by,
Thanks
Joseph.
for having me.
And we'll see you soon. May all your rolls be 20s.
Deathbringer again. Want to hear a joke about Cthulhu? Never mind. It's an old one. For more humor only real nerds will understand, subscribe to this channel and watch more Dungeon Craft.